Today we're heading into southern Morocco, the high pre-Saharan valleys, the mountain ranges, a really stark landscape, historically defined by, well, survival.
Yeah, the constant challenge of hunger and thirst, as you said, it shapes everything.
And our sources today, they focus on this ancient institution, collective granaries. Igudars, or Igudārs, they're called locally.
Right.
What's fascinating, really compelling, is that about a century back, colonial authorities basically declared them dead, an archaism destined to vanish.
They completely wrote them off, assumed modernity would just sweep them away.
But here's the twist. They're still functioning. And not just barely, but their vitality seems deeply connected to something else. These regional spiritual centers, the Zawyas.
Yeah, that connection is key.
So our mission is to figure out this persistence. How does this concept of Baraka, divine blessing, maybe providence, how does it actually act as the engine, the organizing principle, keeping this ancient economy alive?
It's a fantastic question. And a lot of this comes from the work of Salima Naji, an architect who did extensive fieldwork.
She didn't just look at old maps then.
No, far from it. She documented a living system. Over 300 granaries she looked at across this huge area, from Dra right over to Tazerwalt.
Wow, that's a huge region.
It is. And her work, it really makes you question that simple idea of progress, doesn't it? What happens when a deep, traditional system turns out to be more resilient than the modern things meant to replace it?
Okay, let's start with the basics, the history. Why build these huge fortress-like granaries in the first place?
Well, think about the environment. Unpredictable climate, potential attacks from rival groups. Storing grain wasn't a luxury, it was fundamental group survival.
So security was paramount.
Absolutely. These structures, they were built like citadels, often perched high up on rocky outcrops, really hard to access.
Like the little forts.
Exactly. Fortifications, essentially. Each family or clan rented a cell inside. Thick walls, one guarded entrance, very secure.
And this practical need, this is what those early colonial researchers back in the 1930s kind of missed or misinterpreted.
Completely misinterpreted. You look at studies by people like Robert Montaigne, they saw the beginnings of centralized administration, markets developing.
Right, the modern state arrived.
Yeah, and they just concluded, okay, these collective granaries, they're fragile, they're outdated, they'll disappear. They saw them purely as economic relics, missing the whole social fabric.
But the newer data, Naji's work, shows hundreds are still active. Counterintuitive if markets and banks are supposed to take over. So where are they surviving?
It's really about the context. They thrive in the more remote areas, the places furthest from the sort of cash economy of the cities.
Okay, so where money isn't the main medium.
Precisely. For these communities, lacking significant monetary resources, the collective granary isn't some nostalgic throwback. It's still the best, most reliable way to guarantee what they call the minimum vital.
The absolute essentials.
Yeah, grain for people, but also, crucially, fodder for animals to get through the lean winter months. If you don't have cash for insurance or imported food, this is your safety net.
And the human roles continue too. The sources mention the guardians, the Aduab or Amin. They still hold the keys.
Oh, yes. And it's not just symbolic. There's this wonderful example of Sultana, the guardian of Agadir and Amr. She physically holds the keys.
She embodies that continuity.
She really does. She's not just a guard. She represents the community's collective pact, its history, the sacred trust involved in that stored wealth.
Okay, so we have the physical structure, the guardian. That's the frame. Now, let's talk about the engine, the sacred link you mentioned. How does a granary become spiritual?
This is where it gets really interesting, moving from just practical economics to what you might call a sacred economy. Many granaries are actually called Zawyas. And a Zawiya is a spiritual center, often built around a saint's tomb. So by linking the granary to the saint, it becomes more than a warehouse. It's a kind of spiritual relay point. Part of this bigger interconnected system, the source calls it the system Zawa Grenier.
The granary shrine system. And this is where Baraka comes in. Explain how that works, not just as a belief, but as an actual economic practice.
So Baraka is Divine blessing, sacred energy, the thing that ensures prosperity, fertility, the whole system is designed to activate it, to keep it flowing. And it does that by making sure the stored wealth circulates back into the community, especially to those who need it most.
How does that circulation work day to day inside the granary?
Through small daily rituals. When someone comes to take grain for their family, they leave a tiny amount behind in special jars or offering trunks, usually near the entrance.
Offerings.
Yeah, often explicitly dedicated to the local or regional saints. It's like a tithe, small constant tax on your own withdrawal, your own prosperity.
So this grain accumulates over time. What happens to it?
It's set aside entirely as a donation for the most deprived people in the community. This structured, ritualized charity is absolutely key.
Why? How does giving grain away help the community overall?
Because it's seen as pleasing the saints, the source of Baraka. By giving away a portion now, the community is essentially investing in future protection, ensuring the fertility of the land, the health of the animals for the next harvest. It's insurance, but spiritual insurance.
That's quite a different way of thinking about savings, giving it away to secure your future.
It's what the source calls favoring a compatibility of expectations. You're banking on divine providence, essentially. Making a deposit with the saints today guarantees their favor, their baraka, for tomorrow. The goal isn't just hoarding, it's keeping that sacred energy circulating.
Okay, that's the micro level, the daily offering. But this feeds into something bigger, right? An annual pilgrimage.
Yes, exactly. On a macro scale, each year, the tribes with active granaries gather a significant chunk of their harvest, more than just the daily bits, and they transport it collectively to the major Zawyas in the south. Places like Igudārs, Timgrout, Tazerwal.
These sound like huge events.
They are big annual gatherings, the Eifa or Mawasim, very ritualized. There are collective donations, animal sacrifices. It's a public reaffirmation of their allegiance to the regional saints.
Renewing the pact.
Renewing the pact, exactly. Many of these saints trace back to really influential movements like the Jazilite movement in the 16th century. It's deep history being enacted.
Can you give us a snapshot? What happens at somewhere like Igudārs?
Right, Igudārs. Maybe not a major political power historically, but spiritually still incredibly important. Pilgrims travel hundreds of kilometers for the spring musems.
And the donations they bring.
Critically, they're redistributed almost immediately. The Zawya receives the gifts, the grain, the animals, and distributes them back out to the pilgrims, the poor, the needy right there. It reinforces the core idea. Wealth is tied to sharing. If the giving stops, the Baraka stops.
So it's this really robust, resilient system. Based on security, yes, but sustained by this deep faith economy. Written off by colonial powers, yet still going. But now, let's jump to the present. What's putting pressure on it today? The sources say it isn't necessarily local economic changes, but something more abstract.
That's the argument, yes. The threat comes from two powerful abstract forces: globalized religion and universal heritage. It helps to think about different types of institutions here.
Okay, let's unpack that. We can think about personified institutions versus institution things. The Agadir, the granary, and the Zagya, the shrine. These are personified. They're tangible, rooted in a specific place. They embody that link between daily life, the economy, and salvation, the Baraka. They have a name, a place, even a face, like Sultana the Guardian. Local, specific, embodied. Got it. So the threats are these institution things.
Exactly. Things like religion with a capital R or heritage with a capital H. They're abstract concepts. They're transcendent, easily globalized, detached from a specific territory or pact. They can apply anywhere.
And that gives them power over the local personified system.
It really does. Let's take the first one, globalized religion. How does a push for religious orthodoxy, which sounds faith-based, actually dismantle this system?
Yeah, that seems paradoxical.
Well, the pressure often comes from a kind of purificatory drive, spread through global media, certain educational channels. It critiques the traditional local practices, visiting saints' tombs, the whole Zawyas structure.
These get labeled as superstitions.
Sometimes, yeah. Or heterodox. The push is towards a simpler, supposedly purer, direct relationship between the believer and God, which, makes the local saints, the intermediaries, and their Baraka systems seem unnecessary, even wrong.
So it directly attacks the foundation of the Baraka economy.
It does. It attempts to empty the sacredness from these specific places and practices, breaking that traditional chain of obligation, aid, and divine favor.
Okay, that's one pressure. Then there's the other, this idea of universal heritage. That sounds positive, like preservation.
It sounds positive, but the sources argue it can be a kind of cultural violence in practice. When these granaries get classified as universal cultural heritage, you often get external actors coming in, city elites, government agencies, maybe diaspora groups.
With restoration projects.
Right. But their focus shifts. It becomes about aesthetics, about history, about tourism potential, rather than the building's actual use by the community.
So they fix the walls, but maybe lock the door?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The granary gets transformed into a beautiful monument, maybe a museum piece or a photo op, but its original purpose, storing grain, facilitating the Baraka rituals, gets sidelined or even stopped. It's emptied of its living function.
It becomes a cult to the monument, as the source says.
Exactly. A restored shell. But the vital process, the daily flow, the annual pilgrimage might be gone. It's a relic, not a living institution anymore.
So we're seeing this shift from these embedded collective practices towards, well, a rewritten identity narrative, focused on history or tourism. If these buildings are to survive functionally, not just as museums, what's the ethical way forward?
The sources stress what Salima Naji calls an ethics of doing. It has to be participatory.
Meaning the locals lead.
Absolutely. External experts can't just impose their vision. The local communities, the diaspora connected to them, they need to define the goals. And crucially, the focus has to remain on the building's utility for contemporary needs, even if those needs aren't just grain storage anymore.
But wait, if they repurpose it for something modern, say a community meeting hall or a co-op storage, doesn't that still risk secularizing it, losing the sacred Baraka element?
That's the delicate balance, the tightrope walk. But the key insight here is that a place that's materially ruined or changed isn't necessarily ruined ideally. The memories, the social bonds, the identity tied to that space, they can persist.
So the spirit can remain, even if the function adapts.
That's the goal, to foster what's called dynamic heritage, allowing the historical logic, that collective spirit, the pacts to be reactivated in new ways, encouraging coexistence between old and new practices. The architecture needs to stay an expression of the collective, avoid a betrayal or emptying out of its core meaning.
This whole exploration of the Zawyas system, it really pushes back against seeing things only through an economic lens, doesn't it? The old theories about needing the granary just for material reasons were clearly missing something huge.
Massively insufficient, yeah. They completely underestimated the enduring power of these long-term social and sacred obligations. The fact that the system still has vitality today, even when things like tribal warfare or widespread famine are less immediate threats.
It shows how deep it runs.
Exactly. It shows that communities still feel this need, this duty to participate in the pilgrimages, to maintain the granaries, because it's tied to their collective identity, their spiritual future, that sacred pact.
And that tension you described between the local, tangible, personified institution like the granary and these big, abstract, global institutions, things like heritage or religion, it feels like a universal struggle, actually.
Yeah, it really is. How do you navigate being modern, dealing with post-colonial realities while staying faithful to your specific history and traditions?
How do you honor a place's past and its ongoing utility?
Without turning it into just a spectacle for outsiders, a glorious but ultimately empty display. That decision, the sources strongly suggest, has to belong to the people whose lives, whose identity, and whose economy of divine providence are still bound up in that place.
A powerful reminder for all of us, I think, when we look at heritage and tradition in our own context. Sometimes the real value isn't just what a structure was, but what it still does, socially and spiritually.
Yeah,